Hello students. With today's lecture, I am introducing you all to the next unit, that is special senses. In this very first lecture, you are going to get knowledge about the functional anatomy of the eye. To start with, let me tell you in brief about the various special sensations present in human body. In humans, the sensations have been broadly divided into two categories: general sensations and special sensations. There are few organs in the body which collect information of special significance to us from the external environment and are thus called as organs of special senses. The special senses involve sensation of vision, sensation of hearing, sensation of taste, and sensation of smell. I will be teaching you all in depth about the sense of vision or eye. The sensation of vision is the gift from God to all human as well as animals. It is a complex function of two eyes and their central connections. Humans have two eyeballs that are able to perform their functions with the help of following physiological activities. These physiological activities are by maintenance of a clear media of the eye, by maintenance of normal intraocular pressure, by the image forming mechanism, by the physiology of vision, physiology of binocular vision, and physiology of pupil, and physiology of ocular motility. Before discussing the details regarding these physiological activities in eye, let us know first the broad outlines of the functional anatomy of eyeball and related structures. There are two eyeballs, each being suspended by extraocular muscles and facial sheaths in a quadrilateral pyramid-shaped bony cavity called as orbit. See, this is the bony cavity, which is called as the orbit, and inside this orbit lies the eyeball, supported and held in position by the extraocular muscles. Each eye is protected anteriorly by two shutters called as eyelids. The anterior part of the sclera, that is the whitish part of your eyes, and the posterior surface of the eyelids are lined by a thin membrane called as conjunctiva. For smooth functioning, the cornea and conjunctiva are to be always kept moist by tears, and tears are produced by the lacrimal glands. Eyes have a set of 6 extraocular muscles, namely superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial and lateral rectus, superior oblique and inferior oblique muscle. These muscles control the movements of each eye in various directions, whereas the intraocular muscles of the eye include ciliary muscle, sphincter pupillae, and dilator pupillae muscle. The eyelids, the eyebrows, and the conjunctiva plus the lacrimal apparatus are collectively known as the appendages of eye. The eyebrows are arched structures placed horizontally over the superciliary ridge of the frontal bone. The eyebrows are separated by the glabella. The function of the eyebrows is to protect the eyeball from sweat, dust, and other foreign bodies. The eyelids are mobile tissue curtains that are present over the eyeballs. Eyelids act as shutters and protects the eyeballs from any injury or excessive exposure to the light. They also help in spreading the tear film over the cornea and conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is a translucent mucous membrane that lines the posterior surface of the eyelids and the anterior aspect of the eyeballs up to the limbus. Conjunctiva is divided into 4 parts, namely palpebral conjunctiva, bulbar conjunctiva, fornicis, and the plica semilunaris. Here in this picture you can see this is the palpebral conjunctiva that lines the posterior surface of the eyelids. It is present on both the sides, that is on the upper side and on the lower side and inside the eyelids. So this is the palpebral conjunctiva. The bulbar conjunctiva covers the anterior part of the eyeball up to the limbus. Limbus is the junction between the cornea and the sclera. Now, third part of the conjunctiva is the fornices. So there are two fornices, namely superior fornis and the inferior fornis. These are basically a type of sac formed at the junction of the bulbar conjunctiva and the palpebral conjunctiva. So this line you can see, this is the inferior fornix and this has to be the superior fornix, which is not visible in this picture. Now the last is plica semillunaris. Plica semillunaris is a pinkish crescentic fold of the conjunctiva which is present in the medial canthus of the eye. Now let us see the structure of eyeball in detail. Each eyeball is a cystic structure which is kept distended by the intraocular pressure inside it. Human eyeball is a globe-shaped structure having an antero-posterior diameter of 24 millimeters. The anterior part of the eye is called as the anterior segment and the posterior segment or the posterior part of the eye is called as the posterior segment. See, the anterior part of the eyeball is small and forms the 1/6 of the eyeball, whereas the posterior part of the eyeball is larger and it forms around the remaining 5/6 part of the eyeball. The center of the anterior curvature of the eyeball is called as the anterior pole, whereas the center of the posterior curvature of the eyeball is known as the posterior pole, and the line joining this anterior pole with the posterior pole is known as the optical axis. This blue colored dotted line shows the optical axis of the eyeball. Now there is another axis known as the visual axis. The visual axis is a line that is joining a point present in the cornea a little medial to the anterior pole of the eye called as the fixation point with the fovea centralis. So this red color dotted line which joins the fovea centralis with the fixation point, this shows the visual axis of the eyeball. What is special about this? It is that all the light rays which is entering into the eye from the atmosphere, they enter the eye via this visual axis. Now, these two are imaginary lines. The fovea centralis is the center point of the macula densa. That is, it is a yellowish pigmented spot present in the posterior pole of the eyeball. This is the area for macula lutea, which contains the fovea centralis. The fovea centralis is situated approximately 3 mm temporal to the optic disc and it has a diameter of 1.5 mm. The special thing about fovea centralis that is to be remembered is that this part is only made up of cones and no rods or blood vessels are present in this part. Therefore, fovea centralis is the point of greatest visual acuity in the eyeball. Now, there is an area called as the optic disc. Optic disc is that area of the retina where the optic nerve leaves the eyeball to form the optic tract. Another important area that must be remembered is the blind spot. The blind spot is a point on optic disc that lies 3 mm medial and slightly above the posterior pole of the eye, somewhere here. You can say that the blind spot is same as optic disc since no photoreceptor, that is rods and cones, are present in the optic disc. Therefore, no vision is possible in the blind spot. The eyeball comprises of three coats or walls, namely outer or the fibrous layer, middle or vascular layer, and inner or nervous layer. The outer coat includes the cornea and the sclera. Here you can see the grey colored part. The outer coat is consisting of the cornea anteriorly and posteriorly the sclera. The middle coat includes the choroid, ciliary body and the iris. This yellow colored structure you can see here, yellow colored layer, this is the choroid and it is also including the ciliary body as well as the iris. And the inner coat includes the retina. The innermost layer is the retina. This is the pinkish or reddish part which you can see. This is the retinal layer. Let us see the structure of outer fibrous layer of the eyeball. The fibrous coat is a dense, strong wall which protects the intraocular contents. The anterior one-sixth of this coat is transparent and is called as cornea, whereas the posterior five-sixths of this coat is opaque and is called as sclera. The junction between the cornea and the sclera is called as the limbus. See here, this part is cornea anteriorly and which continues posteriorly as the sclera, which is the opaque part. Now let us focus on the cornea. The cornea is a transparent avascular watch glass-like structure with a smooth shining surface. It has a diameter of 11 to 12 millimeters and has a thickness of central part as 0.52 millimeter and of the peripheral part it is around 0.67 millimeters thick. The refractory index of cornea is 1.37 and cornea is a very sensitive structure towards touch, pain, pressure and temperature. Since it is an avascular structure, it derives its nourishment mainly from aqueous humor. Next comes the sclera. Sclera is a strong, opaque, white fibrous layer. It is relatively avascular structure, about 1 millimeter in thickness. It is pierced by various nerves and vessels entering the eyeball. Next is the middle or the vascular coat of the eyeball. This middle coat of the eyeball is also known as the uveal tract and from anterior to posterior can be divided into three parts, namely the iris, the ciliary body and the choroid. Since it is a vascular layer, therefore the blood supply to this part comes from short posterior ciliary arteries, long posterior ciliary arteries and anterior ciliary arteries. The iris is a colored circular diaphragm with a central aperture or the opening of about 3 to 4 millimeter of size called as the pupil. The pupil constricts and dilates by the contraction of intraocular muscles called as sphincter pupillae and dilator pupillae respectively. By this, the pupil regulates the entry of light into the retina. The iris divides the space between the posterior surface of the cornea and the anterior surface of the lens into two compartments or chambers known as the anterior and the posterior chambers. Next is the ciliary body. The ciliary body is the middle part of the uveal tract. It is seen as a triangular shaped structure with the base forwards. See here. This is the ciliary body. You can see it is in the shape of a triangle with its base forwards. Now, anteriorly, the ciliary body is attached to the iris and posteriorly it becomes continuous with the choroid. Ciliary body contains a non-striated muscle called as the ciliary muscle which takes part in the process of accommodation of eye. There are about 70 to 80 finger-like projections coming from the ciliary body called as the ciliary processes. It is the site of production of intraocular fluid called as aqueous humor. Now the third part of the uveal tract is the choroid. Choroid is a dark brown colored highly vascular layer situated in between the sclera and the retinal layer. Choroid provides nutrition to outer layers of the retina. Therefore, any inflammation of the choroid will involve the underlying retina. The third and the innermost layer or coat of the eyeball is retina. Retina is a thin, delicate, transparent membrane. It is the most highly developed tissue of the eye. Retina contains the photoreceptors, rods and cones and is concerned with the visual functions. You will learn in detail and in depth about the layers of retina and its functions in coming lectures. Now come to the last topic for today's lecture, that is chambers of eye. The interior of eyeball consists of anterior and posterior chambers that contains the intraocular fluids, namely aqueous humor and vitreous humor, and the crystalline lens. The anterior chamber is a space bounded anteriorly by the backside of the cornea and posteriorly by the anterior surface of the iris. So this is the anterior chamber and it is filled with aqueous humor. Whereas the posterior chamber is the space between the front of the crystalline lens and the back of the iris. So these two are the posterior chambers of the eyeball. It is also filled with aqueous humor. The anterior and the posterior chamber communicate with each other through the pupil. This is all for today's lecture. Thank you.